Nick, thank you so much for being a guest on my podcast, Therapy for Guys. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a few months now, and I'm really excited about connecting and just having this conversation with you.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah. So where I kind of like to start is really directed toward the listeners. For those who haven't heard about your scholarship, who wouldn't know who you are, would you mind just spending a few moments talking about, yeah, what you're up to, what your scholarship is about, and where you work, what you're interested in, and then from there we can jump into the conversation.
Yeah, sure. It's always so difficult, I find, to do that introduction because my work is all over the place. I do so many different things from so many different angles.
And that's one of the things
But
I love about you.
yeah, I'm a professor of psychology at California Institute of Integral
Oh
Studies,
yeah.
and so that's the uh, professional piece. My master's degree is in somatic psychology. My doctorate is actually in a field called transformative studies, where I study transformative learning processes.
Mm.
And I'm pretty wildly transdisciplinary with my work. I'm also an Aikido teacher. I've been an Aikido teacher for many years, and so that so much of my work is very embodiment focused,
Yes.
very focused particularly on this juncture of embodiment and creativity. um, I'm also uh, autistic, and so being autistic led me into neurodiversity scholarship very early on, when neurodiversity scholarship was uh, not even a thing yet. Kind of been with it from the beginning, laid some groundwork for this emerging field of neurodiversity studies.
Yes.
Um, and it's interesting to be on a Therapy for Guys podcast. I love the title and the concept. I'm an ex guy. I came out as a trans woman fairly late in life, and have not really gone deep into the physical transition process. Still, most people still read me as a guy, and so it's very interesting. Always working around this topic of masculinity for me, because I experienced being immersed in masculinity and not fitting well with it, and then leaving it, and finding
Yes.
out that it was a shell that I had to hatch out of to become myself, and that's an ongoing process. And of course, my queerness and gender queerness and eventual transness also led me to the field of gender studies and queer theory. And so part of where my work has gone over the past several years in particular is into this what I call neuroqueer theory, which is what happens when we extend the queer theory lens into the area of neurodiversity.
Yes.
And so that's an exciting sort of thing I'm exploring. And then I'm also a writer of speculative fiction. I read
Mm.
a web comic called Weird Luck. Co-create that with a little creative team. And so that fiction writing is part of it too. I sort of it's I mean as someone who studies creativity and how to access creativity, I'm very into gender creativity and creativity with one's life, but also with just the plain old creative process of producing writing and art. So I have that practice as well. So yeah, that's kind of a rundown of the major things I do.
I love that. No, and I really in a moment want to jump into your phenomenal work, Neuroqueer Heresies, which I just finished actually listening to. I would encourage anyone who's listening to either read it, you can actually find several of the chapters in your wonderful website, neuroqueer.com, which I'll include in the show notes. But I think it recently came on Audible as well. And
Mhm.
the person did a great job reading it, and it's actually a pretty quick kind of listen. And it's some of the best stuff I've ever accessed in the neurodiversity paradigm literature. So
Thank you.
kudos to you for your phenomenal work.
Thanks. And I'm thrilled. I wrote the book in 2021. And like you say, there's some old stuff on the website that went into the book. There's sort of some early, essays I wrote over the course of a decade, collected in the book, and then my commentary on those essays, and then a whole lot of just new material that just came flowing out of me
Yeah.
when I started putting the book together. So I thought it was going to be mostly a collection of old work, but about 2/3 of it is completely new for the book. And then I was so thrilled with how the audiobook came out. I worked with a Autonomous Press, a small indie publisher, and uh, didn't really have the budget for an audiobook. But then once the book came out and started doing surprisingly well, I got approached by this big audiobook company and
Nice.
really worked with Tantor Media, the audiobook company. Been lovely about it. They worked with me to find the right narrator, and that was one of the sort of interesting transgender pieces, was that I didn't I really wanted um, a, a cis woman narrator whose voice sounded not like my actual speaking voice, which is too masculine for my taste, but more like the way my voice sounds in my head.
Oh,
And
wonderful.
yeah, Janet Metzger, the voice actor they found, just did an amazing job.
I have to agree. And I was actually, my latest interview was with an author who actually read the book himself, but we were kind of joking that sometimes the narrators aren't that great, and so it kind of turns you off. But yours did a wonderful job, I think, reading the book. So I'm glad you found her.
Yeah, me too.
And I have to say too, but before we move forward, just kind of a shout out to Joel Schwartz, who I've had on the podcast before. I believe his practice is total spectrum counseling. He's the one who initially turned me on to your work. And so I'm just grateful to him for kind of connecting us. And yeah,
Joe
I
is wonderful, great
yo,
guy.
yeah, I don't know him well, but he seems like a wonderful guy. And Nick, let me just say thank you for what you said about being willing to come on this podcast called Therapy for Guys. I've actually kind of regretted naming it that in some ways sometimes. I was talking to my wife about this. I've had people who have declined an offer to be on the podcast because I think they are weary of some of the more toxic forms of masculinity in our culture. And I think they think it's going to be like a Joe Rogan or something like that.
Hmm.
And I don't see myself in that vein. I think I'm in some ways the opposite of that kind of form of masculinity. So I'm grateful that you as a trans person is going to come on and help me kind of rethink, masculinity and gender. I think you say in the book that the neuroqueer paradigm kind of fucks with gender and like
Hmm.
gender expectations. And I just love that way of
Yeah.
putting it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, I mean, you don't seem very Joe Rogan like to me, so far, but yeah, no, I think that uh, it's difficult. Being a guy is difficult these days. I
Yeah.
really see it. I mean, having been assigned male at birth and raised to be male, and kind of grappling with that masculinity and what's really me and what's like the learned shell of masculinity I had to put on to survive, and just being close friends with so many cisgender guys. I mean, I really see how difficult it is, and the main model for masculinity is so toxic, and there's so few models for what it means to be a good man, and so much of what we're taught it means to be a man is so toxic and so harmful to everyone, including the people who do it.
Yes.
you know, do that performance of classical masculinity. And and we see that people are falling apart. You
Mm,
know, I mean, look, all the mass shooters are, you know, cisgender, young cisgender men, and,
yes.
you know, just so much warfare and violence that's masculinity driven. And it's like, I think men are desperate for some other way to be that's more meaningful. And I think there's a hollowness and to the masculinity that men are taught to perform, the way that they're taught to do it, that just um, is so destructive. It's so unfulfilling, and they don't know what else to do except lean into it more and more.
Yes. No, well said. So Nick, but before we get into kind of the meat of your book, I have a lot of things that I would love to explore with you. One of the things I like to do with my guests is to just go back to childhood for just 1 second and ask this question, whether it's philosophy or religion or spirituality or some other sort of values-based framework, was there something that you kind of picked up early on that still plays a role in your thinking, still kind of shapes you in important ways? And if not, maybe you could talk about how you've sort of moved away from some of the things you picked up early on.
Yeah. When I was 12 years old, I started, you know, I was, because I was, you know, a trans girl and didn't know it at all. You know, I'm old enough. There wasn't really language for that available to me when I was a kid.
Sure.
Um, but I did not do the masculine gender performance well. There was clearly something queer about me, and being autistic kind of added to that. And So I was bullied a lot when I was a little kid, and when I was 12, I made a decision to fight back,
Mm,
and I mean, just to start fighting bullies physically. And I did realize quickly that I wasn't actually very good at that, and should probably learn a martial art or something. And so I started practicing Aikido. Aikido school had just opened up in my town. It was just, oh, I was there like the first class, and everybody else there was an adult. And it did, you know, it did teach me how to fight, but the most important lessons, you know, the things that what's kept me practicing for 42 years now and teaching it for my whole
wow.
adult life. Really, the most important lessons are about uh, beauty, how to be present and respond and in relationship in the world and in one's own embodiment with grace and harmony, and how to find one's essentially express one's inner beauty and this particular you know, cultivate a beauty and a harmony in one's embodiment and in one's embodied relation with others and the world, and uh, find uh, find some constructive way of dealing with life's difficulties that comes out of that embodied spirit of harmony. I didn't pick up all that when I was 12. Certainly, it took me a very long time to pick that up, and it's still an ongoing struggle against, you know, trauma and acquired, you know, toxic masculinity, and, you know, just being a kind of a, you know, a cantankerous person. Sometimes it's an ongoing struggle to, you know, embody that spirit of grace and harmony. But what I did learn right away that shaped the rest of my life was just the fact that transformation is possible,
Mm,
that if we can imagine a better, more beautiful, more creative way to be, we can make it happen if we find the right practices, and if we pursue those practices with enough dedication, that it's possible and worthwhile. And that's the lesson that shaped all of my work and my whole life.
Wow. I love that, Nick. So you are the second guest so far on this podcast that has talked about the central role that Aikido has played in their life. The first one was Dr. Laura Brown, who's kind of a pioneer in feminist psychotherapy. And I love that both of you are into this type of martial arts, because I do think in the current moment, a lot of martial arts is in, the social media sphere and the podcast sphere. And I think it sometimes gets associated with problematic performances of masculinity. And so
Oh
I
yeah,
love that you and others in this world are talking about martial arts in a way that isn't so toxic.
yeah. And it's Aikido has a really interesting history around that, because the founder of the art, it's a 20th century art,
Mm,
emerged from the 20th century, and the founder, the founder of the art lived from like the late 1800s until 1969, and he spent the first 40 years of his life just out to be the toughest martial artist in Japan and mastering all these highly competitive, very violent arts. And he he had a crisis around that in World War II, because he was uh, uh, a pacifist in terms of not believing in killing, and he saw,
mm,
the Japanese were, really very much, a, a violent aggressor during World War II and committing war crimes, and he was horrified at that. And his what he saw was that the kind of competitive spirit that he had been, practicing in the martial arts for his whole life was a contributor to that. The violent, competitive, masculine spirit of the martial arts was part of what contributed to creating this culture of violence that could
mm,
explode into war. And so he set out to reshape his martial arts practice into something that was not competitive, and uh, that taught compassion and connection instead of competition. And Aikido is the result of that. And it's uh, it's interesting to see it to see Aikido in its encounters uh, with toxic masculinity and competitive values and such, because some people come to Aikido looking ideally to transcend that, to grow into something else. But
wow.
some people come in and are just very put off by Aikido. They can't relate to something that's non-competitive and that involves a softness to it. That's not what were looking for in martial arts. They were looking for, violent blood sports.
Yeah.
And and then there are also people, there's kind of a shadow side to the art too, where
Mm,
people come in. I think Steven Seagal stands out as an example.
oh,
People come into the art, and they find a way to twist it back towards toxic masculinity. They get very competitive and aggressive in their practice.
I remember him from my
Yeah,
childhood. I didn't realize he
yeah.
was Aikido. Wow.
Yeah, he's scary because, I mean, there's good, solid Aikido technique there, but the spirit of, even just the retribution oriented
Mm,
themes of most of his films are like so contrary to the art. And so I think that it's so easily it's so easy even to take and we see this even also with, religions that have a gospel of love and yet somehow turn intolerant too. It's so easy to take
oh yeah.
a liberatory path of love and beauty, and for people to uh, twisted back in the wrong direction. And I think it's a
Mm,
constant contest. It's a constant, like, as an Aikido teacher, I mean, after all these years, there's so many times where I encounter, there's a student, and I'm trying to, work with them, and um, they're, they're in a macho stage early in their training before they've really picked up the harmony. And it's like, I I realize, like, there's this temptation. Oh, I can just force this. I can just, like, show them that my way works by throwing them really hard. But no, that's completely contrary to what we're here for. Like,
mm.
and getting myself to soften in those situations, and uh not get into the macho contest, it just remains an ongoing mindfulness practice, I think, for every Aikido teacher.
Wow. Oh man, those are some powerful reflections. Wow. So I know, like I said a moment ago, I want to get into the real heart of your book, Neuroqueer Heresies. But and you do sort of get into this a little bit, but kind of where I want to start, I think it probably connects to what you do in terms of your role as a professor. I think one of the things that makes you unique, at least in my understanding, in the neurodiversity community, is your work around somatic psychotherapy and embodiment, and then thinking about
Mhm.
gender and some of the neurodiversity stuff with that. I know this is a big question, but can you speak to how you understand embodiment? Maybe what some of your intellectual sources and heroes have been, and how that plays a role in something like autism and neurodiversity?
Yeah, it is a big question. You're right. And um, I the area of somatic psychology that has really drawn me, and is very connected to just my interest in cultivating creativity as
Okay.
well, is um, this idea of uh, moving authentically.
Mm,
And there was, um, you probably know this because you do a therapy podcast, but for readers who don't, one of
sure.
the great pioneers of child psychology was D.W. Winnicott.
Oh yeah.
And Winnicott talked about the true self versus the false self, and how children, every infant has a true self, which kind of is like an innate character. It's very fluid. It's like this combination of innate character and the child's authentic creative responses to the sensory world. Like,
Yes.
the child just spontaneously reaching for something and exploring it and playing with it. And that's those spontaneous exploratory impulses and creative impulses are the true self. And it's very fluid. It's not like your true self has, like, uh, a set of quantifiable characteristics, like the Myers-Briggs type or something like that. It's much more fluid than that. It's just this ongoing capacity for spontaneous
Mm,
emergence and spontaneous uh, creative play and creative engagement with the world. And then the false self is the learned social performances that children, that everybody learns just as part of being enculturated. And Winnicott said, if the child is not given enough space to uh, explore its creativity and express the true self in authentic gesture and interaction, uh, the true self can get just completely buried under the false self. And then what you get is you get these rigid personalities that have difficulty accessing authentic creativity and authentic
mm,
connection. And that can look like toxic masculinity, or, it's not necessarily masculinity that happens to people of all genders, but
sure.
all of those learned rigid ways of being where the person is composed kind of entirely of their traumas and their internalized social and cultural learning, but the authentic is not coming to the surface. Authentic, truly original creative play is not really enabled to surface in the person. And so I'm very interested in somatically in the somatic expression of the true self, that it is very embodied in the what Winnicott called the spontaneous gesture, and in somatic techniques that reclaim that capacity, that recover
Mm.
and cultivate that capacity. So so that involved, sort of studying the nature of the rigidity, another somatic psychology pioneer, Wilhelm Reich, called character armor, like the deeply
Yes.
embedded tensions that hold back aspects of the true self. And so there's like, how do you break down those deep tensions, and how do you find again that capacity of the true self that we're all born with, and so many of us lose or suppress to some degree.
Yes.
Um, and so one of my teachers at CIS, Dr. Ian Grand, who I mentioned in the book in Neuroqueer Heresies,
Yes.
was a huge influence there. And unfortunately, Ian passed away without ever getting organized enough to write an entire book. But he left behind a small number of really beautiful and now hard to find writings
Oh man.
that are just magnificent, and just sort of in old obscure journals and such.
Okay.
And
I was gonna ask you if
uh,
there's one place online I could go because I would love to read that stuff.
yeah, there's
Oh
not
man.
really an online repository, sadly. I mean, the best piece on somatic psychology, like really catches the essence of what I'm about, is a piece that he wrote in 1978 called "The Marvelous in the Real," and he wrote it in a academic somatic psychology journal that went out of business before they even started putting academic journals online.
Oh
And I have
damn.
like this ancient PDF of a scanned photocopy of it. And it's just like I so want to find a way to bring that stuff into print eventually.
Mm.
But then there's others who have published. Another teacher of mine, John Conger, has a beautiful book called The Body in Recovery that talks
Mm.
about that. So there is some stuff like that out there. And that's yeah. Then there's particular practices. There's a whole sort of somatic practice slash spontaneous dance thing called authentic movement that's out there that involves
Okay.
exploring that. I learned a lot also from working with Antero Ali, who was a underground film director,
Mm.
author, and for many years, Antero ran a group called Paratheatrical Research that was an experimental physical theater group that did this like Jungian infused deep trance state movement.
Oh
And
wow.
I was involved in that for decades, uh, while he lived in Berkeley before he moved up to Portland. And unfortunately, he's in his final years now,
Mm.
not not well physically, and but he left behind this really extraordinary legacy that's not very well known, and
Sounds fascinating.
it's amazing work. I've never seen anything like it, and so that really shaped me too, and still continues to shape my work. So yeah, there's all of that, and I guess tying that back to the neurodiversity question.
Yes.
um, I mean, autistic people have very distinctive ways of moving and very distinctive ways of that embodiment is related to cognition. And what happens is,
Sure, like
you know,
stimming.
yeah, stimming, exactly. This whole like using bodily movement and sensory self-stimulation, touching and smelling things, and just grooving on the physical senses and bodily movement and rocking back and forth and all those distinctively autistic things. You know, you can see it kind of in the way I move my hands, the way my head moves, what I do. It's all like, there's
Sure.
these very distinctive ways, and they're cross-cultural. That's what's really striking about
Oh
it.
yeah.
And the true self thing is that you'll see autistic people from vastly different cultures with vastly different conceptions of body language moving in some similar ways that's somehow innate to autistic cognition
Oh
and
yeah.
deeper than culturally learned body language. So, so part of that was like autistic people are taught generally, like socialized into this normativity, into trying to imitate the embodiment of non-autistic people and to
Mm,
suppress autistic ways of moving, and that cuts off uh, our access to a lot of the capacities of our consciousness, self-regulatory capacities
mm,
and cognitive capacities. And what happened for me was when I started reclaiming the ability to stim and move autistically, when I started breaking down the rigidity, I built up all this bodily rigidity uh, to protect myself when I was a kid, like suppressed my autistic ways of moving a lot for to fit in so I wouldn't be targeted. And
sure.
when I started in my 30s to reclaim that and gradually pursued that for it's a long journey of reclaiming these uh, spontaneous capacities for autistic movement. That's really, like, to me, very much about Winnicott's true self and reclaiming that. When I started doing that, I I I my capacity to just be okay
Mm,
enormously increased. Like my, years of, depression and anxiety just kind of gradually went away, and this capacities for joy and grace started emerging. My Aikido practice improved. My ability to connect with other people in the world improved. Just be present in my body. And then there was this expansion of cognitive capacities too. But I'm a college professor now. I didn't start going to
mm.
college. I didn't start going to college until I was in my 30s,
Wow.
and I kind of couldn't get it together cognitively to like focus well enough, and
Mm,
my capacity to do that and to be creative, like, really came out of being able to move creatively
mm.
and spontaneously and authentically. So yeah,
That is so
that's
beautiful.
yeah.
You know, Nick, one of the things I really love about what you've been talking about just there is framing the true self through embodiment as an embodied reality. I've
Mhm.
been a part of in the past sort of religious and spiritual circles that have picked up Winnicott's idea of the true self or the false self, but it always seems like this disembodied, almost immaterial substance in us, like the soul. And I'm not necessarily against that, but I think it misses what you're describing, which is the centrality of connecting that to soma, which is the Greek word for body, for,
Mhm.
the fact that, as you write in your incredible book, we're not just minds, we're not just souls, we're mind bodies.
Yeah,
I just think that's really important to highlight. So thank you.
yeah, absolutely.
So are you okay if we kind of jump into neuroqueer heresies and I just kind of ask you a couple questions that I had? Just,
Let's do it. Let's jump.
okay. Okay. Awesome. And I'll say this, if I ask a question that you feel like could be asked in a better way, or if I'm missing one of the threads, please feel free to stop me and, point me in the right direction.
Absolutely.
Okay, where one of the places I want to start is just by you helping us understand what I think you described as the difference between a medical versus a social model of thinking about disability,
Hmm.
and maybe just kind of unpacking that and then how that would connect to autism specifically.
Yeah, that that medical model of disability versus social model of disability is absolutely not original with me or with the neurodiversity movement. It comes from
Sure.
disability rights activism and this whole field of disability studies. And actually, So it's kind of not my field. And the reason that I wrote about it in Neuroqueer Heresies was because I was using, I used the book as a textbook. I teach an intro to neurodiversity studies course.
Oh, okay.
And what would happen is that every semester, students would come in with, no background in disability studies, because it's not really like taught most of the time in
Right.
schools. So undergraduate students come in, they've had no exposure to these concepts around disability. And so every semester I'd have to explain it. And so I was like, I'm just going to write it into the book so that I don't have to explain it every semester.
There you go.
But there's a lot of wonderful writing about it in the field of disability studies and sort of the nuances of it and such. But essentially, the medical model locates disability within people. So a disability, say you have a disability, and this is something that's a medical flaw that you have, a medical defect, and the social model says people may have impairments. You can't see if you can't walk, you can't walk. There's legitimate impairments that people have, but the degree to which people are disabled is about how their particular needs and abilities and impairments interact with the way society accommodates them, the way the environment accommodates them. So, so disability is not an innate, objective, fixed thing in a person. It's always relational. We think about it. The opposite of disabled is not healthy. The opposite of disabled is enabled. So society is set up, society is set up to enable our participation. You live in your native country, and you go to, use an ATM or catch a bus or anything, and there's instructions and signs and such in your native language. And so you can read them and your participation is enabled in that way. Now, if all this information, the instructions on the ATM, the buttons on the ATM, and the bus stop schedule signs, if that's all available in Braille, then it enables blind people to have access. And if there's nothing like that to accommodate blind people, well, then the blind people are disabled by that. The blindness exists as an impairment either way, but the degree to which blind people are disabled or any other people are disabled is about how much are their needs being accommodated in the local environment. So, so then it becomes, so that the medical model really is like, okay, well, the only hope for you is if we fix you, if we find a cure, if we find a way to fix you. But the social model says, no, we can enable the participation of more people, including people with a variety of, impairments and illnesses, or just who are, whose basic access needs differ from the majority of the population. We can enable their participation instead of disabling them by finding ways to accommodate their access needs.
Yes. Oh, yeah. I love that. One of the things that comes up for me, I just want to share this and then kind of go back to your book. One of the most influential works for me in like the field of just psychotherapy, he was actually a student of Carl Jung, James Hillman.
Oh yeah,
And
I know Hillman's work. It's
okay,
lovely.
he kind of co-wrote a book, which was a series of interviews with actually a Los Angeles-based journalist, I believe, Michael Ventura, where the book is called "We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and We're Not Any Better," which I think is actually fascinating. And I mean, they write and talk about a lot of different things, but there's just one line in the book that really struck me, where Hillman basically says, "Look, in psychotherapy, we kind of operate at the time under the assumption that we have, in scare quotes, a sick soul. Our client or patient has a sick soul." He says the reality is we live in a sick society.
Yes.
And so he was trying to push people toward thinking about the toxicity of the system or the environment. And where I want to link that to your book, this was really striking to me. So working, I think about 95% of my clients are autistic, working, pretty heavily in that community. You hear a lot from parents, well, my child is high functioning or low functioning. The other day, I even heard mid functioning, which I'd never heard about before. And what I loved about your book is you said, we actually have to apply those categories to our society. Do we have a high functioning or low functioning society? And I was just wondering if you could kind of unpack that, because that was really eye opening for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's essentially it. That these labels get applied to autistic people, and they're really like they're highly, what I call neuronormative. They're
Mm,
highly biased towards a particular constructed social norm, which is a non-autistic social norm. So autistic people get called high functioning or low functioning, and the assumption behind that is that there's a non-autistic way that's the right way to function, and you're higher or lower depending on how close you come to being able to imitate that.
mm,
And so, when an autistic person is called high functioning, it usually just means like they are able to imitate a non-autistic person, to some degree, and uh, which is not necessarily healthy for them to do.
mm.
It may mean sacrificing the true self to do that, and being under constant strain, forcing themselves to do it. And also, when somebody gets labeled as high functioning, it's hard to get them accommodations. They're
Yes.
it's hard to get them their actual access needs accommodated. If you're like, oh, you're high functioning, you don't need that stuff, and don't realize what's happening is the person is exhausting themselves and destroying themselves trying to fit in and trying to act like a non-autistic person, because that's what they've been taught to do. And then low functioning, if someone gets labeled as low functioning usually just means non-speaking.
Yeah.
Like, it's often just this bias towards oral speech, and some autistic people, and it just used to be and still is widely assumed that there's a lack of intelligence if a person can't speak. And yet, I mean, Stephen Hawking couldn't speak. And
Yeah. Yeah.
when you I mean, and what happens is, when you give a lot of non-speaking autistic people, you give them the right kind of support and training, and they learn to use various assistive technologies like the Stephen Hawking style,
Sure.
uh, voice synthesizer thing.
Yes.
What happens is, they're highly articulate, and there's some very extraordinary non-speaking autistic poets, for instance.
Mm.
And that is there's a lovely book, in fact, recently out, called "May Tomorrow Be Awake" by my friend Chris Martin,
Oh,
about
wow.
his work with young non-speaking autistic poets. But the um, what happens is they get labeled because they don't speak, and often the inability to speak is just sort of um, an impairment in physical coordination.
Mm.
And there's physical coordination, what's called dyspraxia, these impairments in physical coordination. And because of that, they get labeled as low functioning, because there's things they can't do for themselves, or they can't speak. But once they're called low functioning, then it's also hard for them to get accommodations, because it's like, well, do we really need to work to accommodate this child in school? If they're low functioning anyway, they don't really have potential.
Yeah.
So it's in this whole language of high functioning, low functioning, not only sort of assumes that the non-autistic way of being is the ideal that everyone should aspire to, and you're higher or lower depending on how close you come, but it also ends up being an impediment to autistic people's access needs being met in general.
Mm.
Um, uh, so, I really favor dropping that whole, like, labeling anyone as high functioning or low functioning, because who can say what the proper function of a human being is. We're not
Mm.
machines. We don't have one proper function.
So
Uh,
true.
so uh, the so yeah, so what I propose in the book is instead we call societies high functioning or low functioning, and a high functioning society is one that can enable the participation and well-being of more of its members.
Mhm. Yes. And this was something Joel Schwartz brought up too. And I'm not an economist or a philosopher, but I worry sometimes that the high functioning ideal gets tethered to these capitalist modes of
Mm-hmm.
being and production and performance that I think are problematic for anyone. And so
Oh
I think
yeah,
that kind of stuff has to be thought through and processed.
absolutely, absolutely, very much. And we see that even with the concept of neurodiversity being appropriated now in the corporate world, and especially in the software industry and in places like the Stanford Neurodiversity Project, where they're
So I'm
really
not
just
familiar
looking.
with that. Maybe you could help me understand that. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, what's happening there is that there's the neurodiversity is caught on as this corporate buzzword, and
Mm.
but the corporate neurodiversity initiatives are about how can we exploit autistic labor, like, oh, autistic, like some autistic people have these attention to detail talents, and we
Mm.
can exploit that in the software industry. And it's
Got
never
you.
about like, it's always about like, okay, these people are, it boils down to, these people are desperate for jobs because they're so, autistic people are underemployed. It's hard for them to get jobs because they don't perform, neurotypicality in their job interviews. And
Right.
so they'll be desperate for jobs, so they'll be loyal employees. And it's never like these companies never advance autistic people to management levels.
Mm.
They're always just doing this like uh grunt work, not necessarily treated well, and being, this is an exploitation of labor. And often, I mean, it's a really appalling kind of appropriation of what was intended to be a liberatory concept. Like
Got you.
The Stanford Neurodiversity Project, for instance, actively supports behaviorist methods that uh, autistic, like um, uh, training autistic people to act like non-autistic people. Like they actively support these methods that are well known in the autistic community to cause trauma and harm, and are essentially about suppressing the true self.
Sure. So would
So
they be like encouraging the masking and the guard
they're very
railing?
very much
Okay.
encouraging masking, and just like, how do we get these autistic people to fit in so we can you know uh, exploit their labor better. And uh, just it's very, yeah, it's very capitalism driven and very exploitive and ultimately harmful to autistic people, but it kind of tries to appropriate the the vocabulary of neurodiversity.
Got you. I have I think this is a connect. I have some Buddhist friends that will tell me they mourn the fact that capitalism has taken things like mindfulness and meditation and used it for capitalist ends. I
Mm-hmm.
wonder if there's a connection there, if it's kind of the same kind of thing. They're just utilizing something that's supposed to be liberatory and very humanizing and just almost exploiting
Absolutely.
it.
Capitalism has a real talent for that.
Yeah.
And I mean, one can still, it's like, uh one can still uh use these liberatory tools for liberatory purposes.
Mm.
It's like, in a way it's funny. I mean, I'm also a Zen practitioner, and so yeah,
Oh,
I
okay.
see that appropriation of mindfulness, and in like, how can we use mindfulness meditation to uh you know make our workers more effective. And I see that happen in capitalism, and just sort of this like very like mindfulness is just a focusing technique rather than as a deep spiritual liberatory
Mm.
technique. And it's kind of a Buddhist lesson in non-attachment to be like, well, I'm just going to keep doing my practice, and the fact that these other people are doing this debased version of it for corporate profit is, something that doesn't have to affect my practice.
Yeah.
But it's one of the reasons that I'm really into, one of the many things that I like about neuroqueer theory and this concept of neuroqueer is it's very hard to appropriate because queer is such a disreputable word, and is so much like the spirit of queering, and queerness is so much about being subversive. It's not really easy to appropriate. There's like rainbow capitalism when they put rainbow flags on stuff to try to sell it,
Yeah.
like Pride Month, but there's still a shying away from the term queer, and this inherently subversive, like bell hooks talked about that with the word queer, that the definition is fluid in a way. It's fluid because it's always like, it starts out being about subverting heteronormativity, but then it's always about subverting normativities. It's always about how do you subvert and fuck with and not be
Yes.
not allow yourself to be stifled by normativity. And so there's sort of like, it's one of those things that does not lend itself really well to appropriation by capitalism.
I love that. Okay, now with that said, one of the strands that I wanted to follow with you, I think you both touch on it a little bit in the book, but in other podcast interviews that I listened to prepare for this one, you kind of lamented that there's been a sense in which neuroqueer has been maybe misappropriated by some in a very narrow way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to put that out there for a second and maybe just make another comment to see if they're connected and you can reflect on it. I have another kind of scholar friend who writes a lot about capitalism and the left, but he will say, there's a sense in which the left can also fall into this super egoic morality and policing of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just love for you to kind of follow those ideas and see what comes out of that, if there's anything that kind of resonates with you there.
Yeah, I think that what's happened, I think I've really turned against identity politics.
Okay, I was hoping you'd get into that.
Identity politics is kind of, and queer theory, the bulk of queer theory has always been uh, uh, has always kind of been not compatible with identity politics. Has always subverted identity politics, because identity politics at its core is this idea that like people have these essential identities, like
Mm,
the identity, is uh people, the sex someone is born, and the physical characteristics that mark them as a particular racialized group, and all of
right.
that, like that these are like, you're just born that way, and that's your essence, and that says everything about who you are, and then that's an identity around which you build uh you know uh around which you build your sense of who your people are and who your enemies are. And there's this kind of a zero-sum game involved there, like
Yeah.
what's good for my people is taking away from someone else. What's good for some other identity group is taking away from my identity group. And it's easy to see it's easy to see when it's the people one disagrees with most doing it, because when you think about it, I mean,
Right.
the first, like the ultimate in identity politics is white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's very easy, as someone who's you know someone who's anti-racist, and who is the descendant of Holocaust survivors. It's very easy for me to see how toxic white supremacism is. But then a little harder to see how so-called progressive identity politics are also toxic and
Mm.
divisive, that I even hesitate to call it left, because I think when I think of, you know, as an older sort of leftist, when I think of left, I think of like labor movements and worker solidarity and economic
Right.
justice. And in a
Right.
sense, identity politics has become the biggest barrier to solidarity. It's in a sense why we don't have a well-organized labor movement in this country,
Mm.
because there's so much divisiveness and so much sense of like so much suspicion across, you know, racial lines and gender lines and such, all of which are just these artificial culturally constructed identities, and
Mm.
people identify with them. And uh and again, really easy to see how toxic it is when people are building their entire identities around toxic masculinity, or around uh, you know, around whiteness and white supremacism. Harder to see that it's really toxic when any group does it, and that, you know, identity politics has to some degree maybe been a necessary stage in the liberation movements for various groups, but it
Yes.
becomes a place where people get stuck,
Mm.
and where it becomes a barrier to connection and bridge building and solidarity and empathy, and people's sense of self becomes entrenched in these essentialized identities, and then it becomes a barrier also to fluidity of the self, and to evolution of the self.
Wow.
So it's and I you know, one of the things when you read, you know, the the fundamental like queer theorists like Judith Butler or David Halperin, who I quote in the book
Oh,
somewhere.
I love that quote. Yeah,
Yeah.
I even wrote, I mean, I looked up there's I think a longer version of the quote, which is just incredible. I wonder if I could read it. Would you mind if I did that real
Oh,
quick?
absolutely. Go for it.
So this is from his book, Saint Foucault Toward a Gay Hagiography, if I'm saying that correctly. Queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. There is nothing in particular to which it necessarily refers. It is an identity without an essence. Queer then demarcates not a positivity, but a positionality vis-a-vis the normative. Queer describes a horizon of possibility whose precise extent and heterogeneous scope cannot, in principle, be delimited in advance.
Yeah, I love
Wow.
that.
Drop the fucking mic, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that horizon of possibility, and that's the title in my book of that final essay on neuroqueer theory, is a
Which was one of my
horizon of
favorites.
possibility. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. That's kind of the whole book kind of, you can see, to me, the book Neuroqueer Heresies is an evolution, because
Yes.
if you look at the early chapters of my earlier writings, you know, my initial writings uh, on autistic liberation that are reprinted in the book, there's a lot of identity politics in there. There's a lot of
Mm,
sense of autistic identity, and like the, you know, that sort of policing of language that's very part of identity politics, of like, you know, why you use this language and not this language. It's a very, and it was very popular among, you know, it sort of helped to build my career and reputation, that it was very popular among
got you.
people who are very into identity politics. It fit well into the discourse of identity politics. And the book kind of traces my evolution away from that, not
Mm,
explicitly, but you can see by the end, by that horizon of possibility long essay at the end on neuroqueer theory, I've really turned away from identity politics and towards this fluidity, that it's
mm,
not, that neuroqueer for me is not about, you know, gay or straight, or autistic or non-autistic, but about everyone's capacity to liberate themselves from the limitations of neuronormativity and heteronormativity.
yes. Oh, I love that. Let me ask you, I wasn't planning on asking this, but one of the things that's coming up for me is, do you think in your framework, in maybe a true kind of, even saying that, I don't like the way that sounds, a true left position, but is there a place for enemies, or do we need to kind of move away from that? I think we can oppose certain things, but I guess, and maybe this is just my framework, I think there's too much scapegoating and enemy building
Absolutely.
in our current climate. That
Absolutely.
if you disagree with me, that's okay, but I'd be curious to hear what you think.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with you. I think that um, building a sense of building building a list of enemies based on identity politics is a terrible idea.
Mm,
Black people are my enemy, white people are my enemy, this
right.
group is the enemy, the gays are the enemy, oh my God, the straights are the enemy, men are the enemy, women are the enemy, all of like that's all so toxic and horrible. And it
Yeah.
twists people, even people who are setting out to liberate themselves,
Mm,
like that you see people cross that line often from like women's liberation to all men are the enemy. And it's I think that sort of there's no room for that sort of thing.
mm,
And that's something we've got to move away from in order to build a better, more loving world that has, you know, room for everyone to thrive and be free.
mm,
Um, uh, at the same time, one has to oppose one has to oppose certain things that are uh, that are oppressing one. I think identifying a
yes.
particular group, like if you're born this way, you're automatically an oppressor or not to be trusted or an enemy, like that leads to these, real monstrousness and has led, of course, in the past to genocide and
Right, right.
such. But to say, I mean, I think at this point, like, uh, with so many people in the world starving and homeless, um, a person who's a billionaire who has the resources to fix that for so many people and still live it with extreme comfort, like that's evil.
Yeah,
That's
that's a
wrong.
fucking problem, I think.
That's a problem, And so, but billionaire isn't an essence. It's like
Right.
that's allowing for, like, I think at this point, in a sense, the billionaire class is an enemy because they've hoarded resources
Mm,
in a way that's actively causing massive human suffering. But a billionaire at any point could decide to start giving away all their wealth and putting it into housing the homeless and feeding
right.
the hungry. And then they should be embraced as a friend and an
Mm,
ally. It's
yes.
like they're not the enemy forever just because they were, like, billionaire is a form of conduct
Mm,
rather than an essence.
sure, sure.
So it's like the act of being a billionaire is a harmful action and that needs to be opposed. A person who has stopped doing that doesn't need to be opposed. Like, billionaire is not an essence. And so I
Yes.
think that
Yes.
and I see that with like, there's this, behaviorist method called ABA that's inflicted on a lot of
Oh,
autistic
sure,
children that's
sure.
very harmful to them.
Many of my clients have sort of come from that early in their kind of their early childhood, for sure. I'm very aware of
Yeah,
it.
you see how it harms people. It's a
Oh, yeah.
suppression of the true self.
Yes,
And I
100%.
I used to have this idea, of course, when I was younger and more hot-headed, of ABA practitioners
Mm,
are the enemy, and I've shifted to ABA as a practice is an enemy. Not the enemy is not a person.
got
It's
you.
like being a billionaire or uh, racism or like just sense of scarcity and everything's a zero some game. These habits of thought and behavior are the enemy rather than people being our enemy. And
Sure.
so it's the practice of ABA that is the problem. And by not treating every ABA practitioner I encounter as an enemy, I've converted some of them. I get ABA practitioners in my psychology classes in school who learn and are like, I'm not going to do ABA anymore.
Yep.
And if they came in and I immediately was like, you're the enemy, you're evil, you're foul and vile, like I would never get through to them.
Mm. I
So
think
yeah.
this is happening with some men
Mm-hmm.
in our culture. I end up working with guys who have felt like the enemy. And if I'm honest, some of their behavior has been very problematic and we have to work through that. But I
Yeah.
think they have felt scapegoated and framed as the enemy in terms of this kind of essentialist position. And I think that's
Yes,
problematic.
absolutely. And I mean, uh, it's people still read me as male based on my appearance and voice.
Sure,
You know, I'm out
sure.
as a trans woman, but when people see me on the street, that's not what they think, you know, because I'm
Yeah.
not, you know, I'm still, I haven't done any surgical intervention or hormones at this point. Um, and uh, so I can really see that it's not my conduct, that my behavior is not particularly, my behavior is not particularly masculine, but I see people respond to me still based on my appearance as this must be the enemy, this must be,
Gotcha.
and I absolutely understand, like, you know, men are consistently, because of like toxic masculinity and such, many women are victimized by men. Like
Yes.
that happens,
The data
so
shows it, I think.
yeah, absolutely. And so, if I'm out walking at night and a woman sees me and reads me as male and crosses the street to avoid me, my feelings are not hurt. Like I get, like, this is self-preservation that unfortunately women have had to learn. And in fact, I will cross the street to avoid a woman, to avoid a strange woman, to avoid making her nervous sometimes.
I will actually do the same thing.
Yeah. But and it's very strange to be a trans woman and to be like, I experience myself as femme, but
Yeah.
I know how she's seeing me, and I
Mm.
want to make sure that she's not, you know, scared that I'm not triggering trauma or something. So I'm just going to give her some space. But it's but outside of situations like that, just yeah, that scapegoating of men, that assuming that, you know, uh assuming that men or anyone even assigned male at birth is the enemy, um, is just is this terrible thing, and it definitely it it causes men to get put in this polarized position of being
Yes.
angry at being scapegoated, and it like uh the really misogynist elements of society, the whole like men's rights activist and incel thing and all
Right,
that, and like,
right.
and say, Joe Rogan, Andrew Tate kind of stuff, like the really like the misogynists, the actual misogynists recruit men that way. Are you
Hmm.
tired of being scapegoated?
Oh
Are you
yeah,
tired of being blamed just for being men? It's like,
absolutely.
yeah, it's really the scapegoating of men. In a sense, it becomes like the self-fulfilling prophecy, because, and because what are, you know people people band together for protection when they feel scapegoated. They band together with the people who won't scapegoat them. And it's I see people just, I watched people during the Trump presidency go from like fairly leftist to full-on Trump supporter because they got attacked by like leftist identity politics fans.
Yes.
Like they got, they ran afoul of like the whole Twitter cancel culture thing, and we're like, well, if this side won't have me, like the only people who I'm safe with are this other side, which I think is a terrible mistake, and
Yes.
no excuse for becoming a Trump supporter.
Right, right.
But it's but it's there's got to be some grace and willingness to assume better of people in order to avoid that kind of polarization.
Yeah.
And it's it's that's a real difficult thing. It's part of this crisis of masculinity is in which harms everyone. It's also part of transphobia in a big way, like
Okay.
transphobia, like the transphobic feminists, the ones they call
Uh,
TERFs these
turfs.
days.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh my
TERFs,
gosh.
like what's happening there, their assumption is like, you know, it's still this like 1960s era feminism idea of men are the enemy and
Right.
like anyone born with a penis is male and therefore the enemy. And so instead of when someone's when someone comes out as a trans woman, they're not like, welcome sister,
Right.
let us show you how to be a good woman. They're like, no, you were born with a penis, therefore you're the enemy and you're trying to infiltrate us.
Yeah.
And that's that essentialist identity
It's
politics
very
there.
essentialist, I find.
Yeah.
Man.
And
Wow.
I'm so into I'm just into the opposite. I'm into the
Mm,
fluidity of identity, the freedom for a person to shape themselves, and
sure.
for identity to be a fluid thing rather than a set of absolute categories.
Yes, absolutely. Man, gosh, I'm loving this conversation. Nick, I know I said that we'd go about an hour. Do you have time for one more question?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm loving
Okay.
this conversation too.
Okay. Awesome. So I want to actually, if you're okay with that, I want to read the full quote that you bring up in your book and several other interviews from, and I'm probably going to butcher his name. He's I guess a political science, Carl
Carl
Deutsch.
Deutsch. Yeah, I think it is
Carl Deutsch.
Deutsch.
Okay, so I kind
Uh-huh.
of looked that up and I want to read it for the audience and then just see what you have to kind of say about it and how it sounds like it's kind of really inspired your work and your project. So he writes, to have power means not to have to give in and to force the environment or the other person to do so. Power in this narrow sense is the priority of output over intake, the ability to talk instead of to listen. In a sense, it is the ability to afford not to learn. And I just love that. Never heard that before. And it's going to be one of those quotes that I go back to.
Yeah.
What
And
yeah,
yeah.
what does that quote mean to you and how it is how has it inspired your project?
Well, it's just a great articulation of uh this dynamic where people who hold power
Mm,
don't have to learn like uh colonizing empires don't have to learn the ways of the colonized. They force the
mm,
colonized to learn their own ways, and we see that also around uh you know the human neurodiversity, where there's people who are more in line with the majority cognitive norms can call themselves normal and force their styles of embodiment and socialization and everything on people who for whom that's not a comfortable fit, autistic people and
right.
such, and they don't. It's like um, a gap in understanding between a non-autistic and autistic person uh, because they think differently and express themselves differently. It gets blamed on autistic deficits rather than
Mm,
on both sides need to work to understand each other. My autistic scholar colleague Damian Milton calls this the double empathy problem.
I love that. Oh,
Yeah. So uh, yeah, I think it's this this slippery thing about holding power and how it it makes people it gives people the luxury of not having to learn excuse me people have the luxury of not having to learn. They don't, because learning is hard work.
Mm.
And that's you know, that becomes like, okay, uh the people holding positions of societal power
Yeah.
don't have to listen anymore. They don't have to listen to those who are in distress and downtrodden. And that, excuse me, sorry about that. Been
No
talking a lot
worries.
lately, but that yeah, that keeps worsening inequalities among
Mm.
people, and then worsens frustrations, and that starts to create also the those rifts where uh, uh, groups that don't get listened to, have to uh, form coalitions among themselves in order to be heard, in order to take some power back so that they can be listened to, because otherwise they're not. And
Yeah.
then that initially becomes liberatory, and then it becomes locked into identity politics and locked into struggle.
Mm.
And so there's this mindfulness required on all sides then, of like willingness to do the effort of learning,
Mm.
um, is crucial, and to do the effort of listening. Um, and then there's there's flip sides to that too. There's one of the things I see in identity politics is this attitude of competitive victimhood, where
Mm.
like even the white supremacists, and the white evangelical Christians who've dominated society for so long now claim to be oppressed victims. And there's there's, in a sense, there's a truth to it, that we've created a society where everyone feels like a victim, because we've
Mm.
created this artificial sense of scarcity, where my gain can only come from your loss, because we're on different sides, because we have different identities. And so everyone feels victimized, and like there's a
Mm.
sense of scarcity. They're not getting enough, they're not getting heard, because we haven't learned how to be a we, and to say, how can we work for the benefit of everyone? And so there's this competitive victimhood of different identity groups all claiming to be the most oppressed. And obviously, some of them can back that up better than others. So have a very hard time convincing me that white Christian evangelicals, especially wealthy ones, are an oppressed group. And
Right.
black people and Jewish people, have these very legitimate histories of like being targets of genocide. So we can see that some might have more legitimate claims, but that's not necessarily helpful. Like,
Mm.
who's got the most, competing over who's got the most legitimate claim to victimhood, is not proving productive.
So true.
It's just
Man.
not helping anyone. And I think that the 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 dangerous flip side of power meaning you don't have to learn and don't have to listen, and that obviously has to be changed. It's essential to get the powerful to listen, and for them to do the work of listening,
Right.
rather than have to listen once there's a revolution or something. It's essential for the powerful to learn to listen, but also uh the flip side of that has now become, um because I feel like a victim, because I'm a part of a group that identifies as victims, or is legitimately a historically victimized group, you have to listen to me, and everything, you're an oppressor if you don't agree with everything I say.
Mm.
And that's also like, that also becomes a problem, because that's also the enemy of uh, civil, intelligent discourse.
I was gonna say it automatically shuts down any sort of constructive dialogue.
I really saw this I really saw this in the 2016 election, and I think this is part of what cost Hillary Clinton the election to some degree, is that there were some very legitimate concerns. I mean, I believe Hillary Clinton would have been infinitely better than Donald Trump as a president.
Same here.
Yeah, but there were legitimate concerns that people had on the left about her policies, about like, are you going to continue, a foreign policy, the foreign policy you had as Secretary of State, which was extremely destructive, or, you're talking about staying the course economically, but a lot of us are suffering economically. There were some really legit concerns about policy. And what I found that was when people expressed those concerns, on social media and other public conversations, they were often, instead of being addressed, they were shouted down by people saying, if you don't want Hillary president, you're a misogynist.
Yeah.
And that, like, women have a legitimate claim of victimhood. Like, there hasn't been a woman president, and that's just plain wrong. But if you use that, like, women are oppressed, therefore you're an oppressor if you don't vote for this particular woman line, and don't address the policy concerns, like, you lose people. And I wish everyone had still voted for her to keep Trump out of office, but that's I think that there's that danger of people in power. It's easy for them not to listen. But people who feel like they're entitled to be listened to because they identify with a historically victimized group, it's also now easy for people in that situation to not listen. And what we end up with is more people not listening to each other. So somehow there has to be this willingness for people to open to listening to each other and having empathy for each other and wanting everyone to succeed together, even those groups that feel, legitimately feel victimized, or like white supremacists who maybe don't legitimately feel victimized, but the feeling is genuine. They still believe it, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So, I think that becomes, and it's heretical. It's blasphemous to say, I think, in the age of identity politics, that, like, it doesn't matter how much, we need to put aside the, like, how much have you suffered? How much are you suffering now? And say, how are we going to move forward together? How are we going to solve this together? Because it's just not working. Otherwise, what we're doing now isn't working. And that's crucial, there's how, we went from a society where there were some people on top, who felt on top of things and, had undue power and privilege, and a lot of people who were oppressed. And where we want a movement like that to go, when you look at the great, liberatory leaders like Martin Luther King, what they want is everybody to be thriving, everyone to be free. And instead, we've somehow now created a society where everybody feels like a victim and nobody feels free, except maybe like a small handful of billionaires. And it's the opposite direction from where it needs to go. And so somehow there has to be a letting go of our, I shouldn't have to compromise because I have legitimate grievances, because everybody thinks that now. And even if I can look at it and be like, oh yeah, some of them actually have more legitimate claims than others, they're just we got to let go of that identity politics thing and just say, how do we move forward together? How are we going to actually get out of the mess the world is in? And I don't think that uh, I don't think that picking certain groups to be the enemies and scapegoats and targeting them is going to do it. I think that's historically always failed and made things worse.
Wow. Nick, I just think you're a beautiful human being with a brilliant mind. I so resonate with your perspective. Is there anything else, either in your life or your project, that I've missed asking that's just important to kind of talk about before we sign off today?
I don't think so. I mean, if you keep asking me questions, I'll talk all day. But I think there's so much to explore, and I'd always be happy to speak again. But
Okay, I would
I
love
feel like
that.
we've covered so much. Yeah.
Yes. But at the same time, I think there's even so much left to explore, even in the neuroqueer heresies.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
maybe next time we can get into your chapter on the person first language, which I think is kind of a paradigm shift and needs to be explored in these communities for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it has been a great pleasure getting to talk with you.
Yes. Would you mind ending with the line of the podcast, which I ask every guest to kind of end with, which is just continue the conversation just by saying those words?
Oh, yeah. What a great line. What a beautiful line. That's kind of
Thank you.
very, very much on point with what we were just talking about, and
Yes. And that's
how,
that's that's why I want people to end with it, because it's kind of the spirit of who I am and what I think we need to be about.
yes. All right, everybody. Continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you.